Welcome to Voices.
A podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
On the role of business in the world.
And in people's everyday lives.
Hello everyone, I'm Neill Wilkins. I'm head of the Migrant Workers Programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. The IHRB, as we are known, work to ensure that business practices conform with international human rights standards. And we work with businesses, governments, trade unions and civil society groups to try to ensure that this is so. We have a long-standing migrant workers programme and are interested in migrant workers in all sectors and all locations. The overarching framework we use in our work are the Dakar Principles for Migration with Dignity, which illustrate the many challenges facing migrant workers and those who recruit and employ them at every stage of a migration episode, from recruitment through employment and on to safe return. The Dakar Principles have now been translated into over 20 languages and are used and referenced by businesses, governments and civil society organisations around the world. Inevitably, the work that we do often has one key element missing: the views and voices of migrant workers themselves, the hard-working migrants on whom so many economies depend. For this, we rely on the organisations closest to them, civil society groups who work with them, help to elevate their voices and represent them when that is the best or only option. The work that these civil society groups undertake is remarkable and yet is often low profile and under the radar. They do, however, help to provide organisations such as mine with insights and advice that we cannot access elsewhere. Today, I'm particularly pleased, however, to welcome somebody whose work is well known. A tireless advocate for migrant workers, William Gois is the Regional Coordinator for Migrant Forum in Asia. William, welcome.
Thank you.
William, the best place to start is, can you briefly explain who Migrant Forum in Asia are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, sure. Migrant Forum Asia is based in the Philippines, but it's a regional network that is made up of civil society organizations very closely linked to migrant and community organizations on the ground, migrant worker organizations, diaspora organizations, and countries of destination, together with civil society, academia, trade unions, researchers, and people from media that come together in this network. It's very movement based, and it works to advance the rights of migrant workers.
And how many groups make up Migrant Forum in Asia?
Well, at any time, we have a network of something like 250 organizations that we are in contact with in terms of memberships, partnerships, associates, and things in that kind of configuration.
And so these vary from small groups right the way up to larger organizations who are in touch with governments in various countries as well.
Oh, yes. These are small groups, very return migrant organizations, for examples, that have just started off. And then there are organizations that have been involved for a long time and at the national level in terms of advocacy for rights of migrant workers. So it varies, and it's across the spectrum in the sense of they work on different issues. So in a certain sense, the network actually covers the entirety of the migration kind of corridor and discourse, because you have some organizations that do direct services. There are from counseling or helping repatriated migrant workers and things like that. Then you have some that run shelters, you have some that do advocacy, that some do training, some engage at national level, some engage at international level with the UN system. So this whole variance of competence within the network, which then we at the regional office bring together in this kind of network platform space and create the exchange and learning kind of thing, so that helps move from a movement perspective the rights of migrant workers.
That's great, and we know from our own experience how valuable the work that your component organisations do is to migrant workers, and we know that our own leadership group for responsible recruitment has benefited enormously from having Migrant Forum in Asia as a member. It's been an extremely useful exchange, and I think that exchange works both ways, actually, that it's been helpful for some of your members to understand a little bit more about how business works. So as well as us learning views up from the ground about the issues and challenges that are impacting on migrant workers, and I think it does us no harm to always be reminded of that. But also, those migrant workers don't just go into this void, they go into business operations, they go into the supply chains of global businesses as well. And so having that dialogue and that exchange, I think, has proved really invaluable for both of our organisations.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it has been a steep learning curve actually for us as well within the network, largely because our network was dealing with migrant workers and their issues itself. And working with private sector or business, this was not seen as our area of engagement kind of thing. Even if we did work, even if we took up the issue of recruitment and recruitment practices and things like that, there was never real engagement with the recruitment sector. But now, and in this partnership that we have had with you, I think it has opened for us a whole new area of engagement and understanding as well. So talking to businesses, trying to understand their perspective, talking to them about supply chains and what happens, looking at their standards and practices that they have put in place for their own companies and things like that, has been quite a learning experience for us within the network to dialogue and to see how we can work with another constituency, and a vital constituency, because in many ways they're the employers of migrant workers, to see how working with that constituency we can actually make a stronger case for moving ahead together on protection of the rights of migrant workers.
Absolutely so, and absolutely long may that continue. William, we're here today primarily to talk about the proposed new justice mechanism for migrant workers that have been impacted by coronavirus. And I know that that's a very important part of your work at the moment. But before we do, we perhaps need to reflect a little on the many challenges being faced every day by migrant workers. The DACA principles that I mentioned earlier outline many of the ways that migrant workers may be mistreated, exploited, or unable to access their rights. How has the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the extent of this sort of exploitation?
Look, the greatest realization we have had, and it was like a time bomb just ticking away, and there's this explosion now that we have to deal with. Because for the longest time, like I said, we've been dealing with the cases of migrant workers, looking at issues from recruitment practice right up to on-site and workplace and the jobs, contract substitution, working conditions, living conditions, and then even on the return, even when they come back, the issues that they have in reintegration and things like that. So within an MFA network, you get all these issues that we kind of take up. And what has happened is the COVID has only shown how this has all exploded exponentially. So it's not as if we are looking at anything new. The virus might be new, but what we are looking at is an explosion of issues that have been persisting for the longest time. And now we have to deal with this, and it's huge, it's exponential.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think from my organisation's point of view, we've, as you know, have had a big concentration on on recruitment fees, because we see that as being, the fact that many migrant workers are paying large, extremely excessive recruitment fees to secure employment abroad, and that this very frequently engenders situations of debt bondage, which then leave workers vulnerable to a range of further exploitations. But the trouble with concentrating on just one aspect of this, of course, means that sometimes other things are becoming not commented on and not remarked upon and not actioned, and change isn't there in some of the other cases where migrant workers perhaps are facing abuse and exploitation. There's a range of these issues that impact on migrant workers, of course. But William, can you perhaps outline for us, some of the impacts of the pandemic for migrant workers who've been trapped abroad? Many migrant workers haven't been able to return home, either through lack of funds or sometimes because of various government regulations from their home governments and governments in destinations. But could you sort of illustrate for us some of the situations that you've been finding from the network around the impacts of migrants abroad?
I think to look at this situation, let us begin with just looking at when the lockdown started. We know that the living conditions of migrant workers, where they are accommodated, that has always been a challenge. Cramped quarters, living in big numbers within a room kind of thing, not proper facilities that are available to them for hygiene and things like that. Now, when the lockdown was imposed, many migrant workers were stuck in that situation. While the international community and the WHO was proposing one way of dealing with the virus was through social distancing, washing of hands at regular level, PPE equipment, and things like that, many migrant workers were trapped in a situation where none of this was possible. Till today, we are looking at situations where social distancing is not possible, where migrants are not given the PPE equipment within that confined space that they are locked up in. And we have seen several countries in which there was a sense that we are tackling the virus, we have reached our peak and we are now plateauing, and suddenly they discover that the concentration of cases in migrant dormitories, migrant worker dormitories, and then this whole stigma of against migrants. Oh, this is that cluster and things like that. But in the first place, they didn't see that. They didn't do anything before that kind of thing when these issues were complained about before in terms of migrant accommodation and things like that. But they were not able to do that before. And now at the time of the virus, when when migrants are vulnerable in that situation, then migrants become then the target of discrimination. Oh, it is these migrants that carry the virus. So it's starting with that. The other issues, of course, information. There was so much of information, lack of information in the early stages, March, April kind of thing, which was not receiving migrant workers, which was not reaching migrant workers. And that created a lot of fear in the community. A lockdown is imposed. They don't know what is happening. They don't know how to deal with the virus. They are not getting enough information because of the lockdown. Businesses are closed up. So migrant workers, for example, for communication, they live on these top-up cards because they don't have postpaid plans for communication kind of thing. As and when they have some kind of money in their pockets, they'll buy these top-up cards for communication. With the lockdown, that was not possible for them. So they couldn't communicate with anyone, not even with their own families back home. This was creating a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, both for the families back home, the fear of their breadwinner, their relatives stuck in a country, in a foreign country, not knowing what to do. And with the virus kind of with the possibility of them catching the infection, and the migrant workers themselves not knowing where to go, who to go to, because even the laws with regard to their residency permits or their work permits, or even just their jobs and things like that, when does it start up and when will they be able to go back, none of this was known. And this was, it had reached a panic-like situation when migrant workers started communicating back home, and we were getting the stories, both migrant workers and civil society in countries of origin called out for this, for the first time in our region, for the right to return. Because at that time, it looked like nobody wanted these migrant workers. The country of destination didn't have a way of addressing the situation, keeping in mind that there is a huge number of migrant workers in the country. And country of origin, because of the lockdown, did not know how to deal with the situation of huge numbers coming back, and what to do with regard to quarantine and testing and things like that. So the anxiety and the stress and the fear that was concentrated in these early months of the virus was something that on a daily basis, it reached the point then that we had to make many civil society organizations made the call for the right to return. For the first time, we've never had this call before. Even in previous times, like for example, the war situation in Libya and things like that, we never had a cry for a right to return in the way we've had it this time, in the time of COVID. And that's only that. Other than that, things like even employers abandoning migrant workers in the sense of not providing them with food, not providing them with rations, not providing them with PPE equipment. Civil society in countries of destination had to take great risk to see if they could be the conduit through which migrant workers could receive this food and PPE equipment and information and things like that. Our own network got involved in translating some of the information that was being put out at the national level, translating that in the language of the migrant workers over WhatsApp and email and things like that, and then sending it back to the migrant workers or through announcements and things like that. So there was lack of information, there was lack of support in terms of PPE equipment, there were issues of food, there were issues of accommodation, there were issues of communication, there were issues of knowing about your employment and your employment status, the fear of becoming undocumented just because your visa was expiring a month after the lockdown kind of thing, or your resident permit was expiring and things like that. The issue of remittances, they were not getting any money, they knew their families were struggling back, they couldn't send anything because the systems were all closed. So the level of anxiety, the level of fear, the level of just feeling abandoned by the state, whether it is country of origin or destination, was something that was very hard for even us to handle. And many of our support groups in the country, many of our civil society organizations, and still till today, continue to work something like 18 hours a day just to be that kind of support system for migrant workers. Where states have failed, civil society has come in.
I think, taking some of those points, with the migrant worker dormitories, we could not have devised a better vehicle for spreading the virus. Crammed, unsanitary dormitories where many migrant workers are forced to live, a perfect place for viruses such as this to spread. We've also heard many tales about the sort of practical work that Migrant Forum in Asia groups have been doing on the ground, not least just really simple things like food distribution to migrant workers who've been locked into certain areas or certain dormitories. And as you say, some of the support groups have been taking tremendous risks to deliver food parcels and make sure that those workers are all right. I think as well, and it's something that's come across a lot that we've been hearing from other groups as well, is around this lack of information, this lack of accurate information, particularly in language, of course, that migrant workers can understand. And I think that this problem was very much compounded because at first there was nobody quite knew what information was accurate or not, but then gradually information would change on a daily basis. And we've heard tales from some of the migrant support groups in Singapore, for instance, that migrant workers, the information or the instructions for them would change, but nobody was relaying that to them, and then they'd walk down the street and promptly get arrested because they'd broken some new law that had been imposed that very morning and things like this. So it was this lack of disseminating the information out to migrant workers, perhaps, that was a key cornerstone of the issues.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when we look at this lack of information, we should look at it from a principle of discrimination as well. You see, because it's not as if you had that information and you could give it to migrant workers. There was no seamless kind of process of giving information to migrant workers, because countries of destination don't have this notion of migrant workers being part of their communities, being part of their societies. They are always the other. So they're the last to think of when you think of situations of crisis kind of thing, because it's an afterthought that we have to translate this into this language. How many languages do we need to translate? It all comes as an afterthought. But if there was a principle of non-discrimination, if migrants were part of an inclusive society, then maybe we would not have had this breakdown in communications. But this is something we have to hit head on, that it's time we looked at migrants not as the other that are doing something that our national workers will not do. They don't have to live in the shadows. They have to be in some way seen as part of our society. And then how do you in a normal everyday situation communicate with migrant workers who are part of your society? I think if this was addressed in the first place, we would not have had this breakdown in communication in the time of crisis.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's during times of crisis like this that you realise how many migrant workers are involved in the economies of these countries. We'll come to talk about that maybe a little bit later. But within migrant workers, of course, another group who might be facing specific challenge, nearly 50%, of course, of all migrant workers are women. Have they faced additional challenges, William?
Oh yeah, for sure. For example, you just take the sector of domestic workers. Now we know, and we've got cases of many domestic workers who had to look after people who had from within the household that they were working in. They had to look after the people who were sick in that household, who may have contracted even the virus. And these domestic workers were not even given the equipment, the PPP equipment. They were not even asked whether is it possible for you to look after the family member who has got the disease, the virus. They were not even given that option. They were told you have to look after. They were kept with this person, locked kind of thing, and no other choice kind of thing. So that was one big issue. The other big issue was of communication, because many domestic workers don't even get a day off. So they couldn't even go out. And again, like I said, it was the communication thing. The family members were not willing to go out for them and get these top-up cards so they can communicate with anyone kind of thing. So other than that, because of the lockdown, now there was even more increased working hours for them, because now the whole family is in the house and the whole family makes demands on the domestic worker kind of thing. So the increasing working hours kind of thing, no rest kind of thing, no communication. And then, of course, the vulnerability to abuse and physical abuse kind of thing was also there. And we got cases like that. We've heard stories like that, even about, wanting to return or even to get out of that situation. There was no choice. They were stuck in that situation. They are still stuck in that situation. And there is no way to reach them as such as well, kind of thing, because of the situation of the pandemic, the lockdown. So while some have managed to communicate with country of origin or with civil society or with support organizations, kind of thing, it has been a real challenge for women migrant workers. It has been a challenge for women migrant workers, for example, because there is those women migrant workers who are with their families in countries of destination. There are certain, they would go home for hospitalization kind of thing, or for giving birth if they are pregnant and things like that. But none of them could do that. None of them, they were all stuck in this situation in which they had no choice kind of thing, no support, because even some of the support that was given to locals was not necessarily extended to the migrant workers and to women migrant workers. So they have lived in this very complex, very stranglehold kind of a situation without having any rights kind of recognized. And this is in situations where they had served these families. These families have became more oppressive in a certain sense. The oppression increased for them tenfold in this kind of a situation.
So once again, we're seeing that, for many migrant workers, they're living in situations that are poor and stressed from the very start, and very often exploitative. And then, of course, the coronavirus has only compounded the problems, and as I guess the tensions that have arisen because of the lockdown and that escalating within households, and of course very often being taken out on migrant workers as well, if not just the general living and working conditions being oppressive. So these are the situations for workers abroad. But what about workers returning home, William? I understand the reception isn't always positive.
And that is the irony of the whole thing, right? Because countries of origin created this whole kind of concept of an environment of migrant workers are our heroes, to the point that even now some countries of destination try to do a celebration of migrant workers in their societies by having one day in which they recognize the migrant workers kind of thing. But in the time of COVID, this whole notion of heroes was totally nowhere to be found. In fact, the whole discourse, the whole narrative changed to these are the carriers of the virus. Many migrant workers who returned home expecting to go to their home communities were told by their own family members not to come back because of the fear that they were carrying the virus. The stigmatization by the communities in some countries, indicators were being put on their homes, on their houses, kind of thing, that here is a migrant worker's home kind of thing, where the state was not facilitating even this kind of movement from up when they return. And when they return to what? No clear information from the country of origin as to what you can expect now. Countries of origin are still trying to arrange so-called policies or programs for returning migrant workers. So that whole planning of that return has been very incompetent in that sense, because from the time they return to the time they reach home, there's no one place that they can go to. There's no system put in place to see how they can, and then they have to deal with this whole issue of stigmatization as carriers of the virus kind of thing. So it has been a real challenge and continues to be a very big challenge. Just to highlight this, even to, in some ways it's so strange that the world was told that the safest way to not to contract the virus was to stay under a situation of lockdown. Everybody stays safe within your homes. But it is at this time that countries have also organized repatriation flights. So for migrant workers to be gathered together, to put on in detention centers or in holding places, then to be repatriated in bulk kind of thing, has been happening while we have been safe in our homes. That shows how we have looked upon as migrant workers, kind of thing, as cattle that could be rounded up and shipped in or shipped out, and this is the saddest phenomena that you can even think about at a time like this, of how people are treated.
You mentioned earlier about migrant workers always being considered as other. And, you know, we know that often underlying the ways that migrant workers are treated are rooted in countries of destination, with discrimination, xenophobia and plain racism. And we need to start calling that out more for what it is. You know, these conditions don't spring from treating people the same. They spring from the fact that you believe that you can treat somebody differently simply because they come from a different country. But it's shocking to realise that even on return, these things and this view of migrant workers as others has also impacted on the response to the crisis as well.
Oh, it is, and it's shocking that it's with their own communities.
Yeah.
And that is the shocking thing as well. And I think it's scary to see how migrant workers, from being heroes, can be stripped of all medals, of all dignity, and just left abandoned like that.
Well, and yet migrant workers are so often the engine that drive economies. They drive economies abroad, and their remittances sort of add significant sums to the GDP of many countries of origin. There's clearly, on that, there's clearly going to be a serious impact on development and the SDG targets, yes?
I mean, for sure, whether it is country of destination or country of origin. I know we have often looked at migrants contributing through their remittances to developing countries or poorer countries, kind of thing, and that's where a lot of the development kind of support is happening. But when you look at populations of migrant workers in some of the countries in which the populations are huge, kind of thing, right? A high percentage of the local population, of the national population, is a migrant population. How can you not say that they are developing, that they are contributing to the development of that country? You know, there are countries that have risen from the ground up because cities have risen from the ground up because of migrant workers. If you don't count that as development, then that's another thing. But if workers have put up cities, they have countries have which were nowhere at a certain time, have suddenly been put on the map of the world, kind of thing, within like half a century, kind of thing. How can you not say they have contributed to the development of those countries? You know, if you look at what they do today within those economies, they are essential workers. We've heard this essential workers now in the time of COVID, but these workers have been essential all the while to the development of countries of destination. And then when when the international community has kind of through the decrease in overseas development assistance and foreign direct investment and things like that, countries of origin have now had to rely on migrant remittances. Then you can see how they are propping up the development of countries of origin. So across the spectrum, whether it's country of origin or destination, nobody is doing anybody a favor here. Migrant workers are essential to development, whichever part of the corridor you are looking at. Or two.
No, exactly. So, and the figures tell the story. I know 2018, it was 529 billion US dollars remitted to developing economies. And that's before, as you rightly say, take into account the impact of those migrant workers on the economies of the countries that they're traveling to as well. And the way that, cities like Doha in Qatar and other places, particularly in the Gulf, have been built from the scratch, built from the sand up. By the hard work and industry of migrant workers, and we definitely shouldn't forget that. And there's talk at the moment that remittances will fall by at least 20% percent. It would seem to me that it's likely to be a lot more than that by the time this thing plays through, and also depending on how long it goes on for, how long where migrant workers are unable to return and begin driving those economies again and earning those money that sends home, that provides so much back in countries of origin, and the development potential of that being eroded and lost.
Yeah, and if you look at this question of remittances, even if the World Bank has said 20% drop in remittances, that's the kind of overall global kind of figure. But when you look at countries that have a huge percentage of their GDP dependent on remittances, hinged on remittances, then you see that some countries of origin will suffer more than others. And that's the big challenge to look at, where countries have been so reliant on remittances. The other issue around remittances is we're all talking about drop in remittances, but I've just pointed out also, I think there is the whole issue of reverse remittances. We are now getting situations where families of migrant workers are remitting to the migrant worker in a country of destination because that worker is stranded in the country of destination. He or she has lost her job, is finding it very difficult to buy that plane ticket back, does not have resources to pay for his own livelihood over there, has been thrown out of accommodation, company accommodation, has to look for some kind of other accommodation and things like that, is in this desperate situation of cannot move even if he or she wants to. And so the family now has to take some loan and remit back to him, where he was the remitter or she was the remitter. Now the family is remitting in the country of destination. And that's the scary part of it, because we all know of the loans they take to get that job in the first place. And now there's another loan that the family has to take to make sure that this person is able to at least live a decent life, or at least a subsistence life in that country of destination. Because a lot of the social protection, and this was another thing we never saw, or we saw prior to the COVID, and has only been exasperated now, is the lack of social protection for migrant workers in countries of destination. So whatever social protection nationals have, migrants don't have that. And so the package that is given at this time doesn't necessarily reach out to migrants. And so again, you have this big situation of a discrimination and exploitation, where they are only sucked for the labor that they can give and nothing much in return in terms of social protection.
William, it's becoming clear as well that as the crisis has curtailed a lot of business activity, some companies have taken advantage of the vulnerability of migrants. We've heard about situations of workers being laid off with no redress, with wage theft, things like that. Can you talk through some of these things that you're seeing, that are the way that migrants are being treated by businesses in some of these countries?
So we've got this whole range of cases that we look at now. One is, for example, businesses who have not been paying their workers even prior to the COVID are now taking advantage of the COVID and laying off workers and telling them there is no job. And they are not getting any of their back wages, and they're being told they should go home, take advantage of the repatriation flights and go home. And many workers, and ironically, even some countries of origin, the missions, are not even documenting this. They're not even documenting this. And migrants are afraid to come and say this is happening to them for fear that they might not be put on the repatriation flight. So we get situations like that. We're getting cases where migrants have been told, okay, because of the COVID, the business is going through a difficult time, and also we'll only pay you half wage, take it or leave it kind of thing. So there's no kind of saying for how long, or will you accept it, what are the alternatives, and all, nothing. This is what you're getting, take it or leave it kind of thing. Migrant workers have been told, look, there is no job, so there's no job, we can't pay you. And then till such time as something opens, we will see what we can give kind of thing. But no kind of support system, no social security there, no social protection there, so they get nothing kind of thing. migrants have been told, yeah, also in many cases have been given only food, and that also just sufficient food to kind of to be just enough kind of thing. It's not as if they're getting full meals and full accommodation and things like that. So these are so many challenges that we have seen of business irresponsibility, but also in terms of these information, not being able to give migrants the information, the facilities that they need to be able to know what to do, to make the choices that they need to make, or what are their options and things like that. There's this whole lack of communication between businesses and the migrant workers that they employ. So this is something that needs to be a bridged kind of thing, and this is one of the big challenges that we are facing at the moment.
So some of this, though, of course, is clearly illegal, criminal activity. And so I think you've indicated, how easy is it for migrant workers to access official justice mechanisms?
Yeah, look, this was always been the case, and you'll always have this in an employer-tied system, because whatever it is in an employer-tied system, there is a kind of power differential between a migrant worker and the business and the employer. And this gets only aggravated at a time like this, and the chinks in the armor kind of thing come out at this time kind of thing, because in normal times, the employer would always have an upper hand over the migrant worker. If the migrant worker were to complain, or the migrant worker would say, no, this is not in my contract, or this is not what I was told I was going to be paid, the option for the migrant worker is either take it or leave it. Now, for a migrant worker who has taken a loan to make this trip and pay this and get this job and things like that, what options are there? What real options are there when he is or she has arrived in the destination country to say, no, I don't want this option that you are giving me. This is not what was in the contract that I was told in my own country. I want to return. How many migrant workers do you think who have taken loans and things like that to get there are going to make that kind of a decision? The other thing is, way into employment itself, it is so easy in some countries for an employer to threaten a migrant worker with the status of being undocumented, because their visa permits or their resident permits, this is all in the hands of the employer. It is so often we have heard of employers not renewing visa permits on time, not renewing resident status on time, deliberately putting this threat on migrant workers that if you don't perform or you don't accept these conditions, then we will term you as undocumented, we'll make a complaint and things like that. There are so many times of workers who have left their conditions of work because they cannot take it anymore. As soon as they leave, you have this notion of absconding or run away. Terms like this, which already pit the migrant worker against the system. And then, so the migrant worker, out of fear of that, continues to remain in the exploitative situation. And if the migrant worker does run away or does leave the workplace because of those conditions, charges are laid on him or her that this person has become an illegal or an undocumented or irregular kind of status. And this is the biggest challenge we have in an employer-tied system. And so for migrant workers seeking justice within the system, the whole thing is you're up against a system that you just can't win against. And we've had so many cases, and this is something that even lawyers have told us, because as MFA we have a network that we work in collaboration with that is called Lawyers Beyond Borders Network. And we were thinking as civil society, with this constituency of lawyers, now we'll be able to process cases through courts and get justice and things like that. And lawyers have come back to us and told us, forget it. Because very many times you will find cases where even if the judgment is in the favor of the migrant worker, enforcing it is not in the power of the courts. So when you have a system like this kind of thing, then that's a real challenge for justice. And now this system has exploded in a time like this. This system has, and so you're getting of these millions of migrant workers who are being repatriated or who are being returned home kind of thing, or coming back home in the millions, there are so many cases of wage theft in this. So many cases.
So William, I know MFA is calling for an overarching justice mechanism for migrant workers to be established. So can you describe to us what you envisage that would look like and who would manage that process?
Well, to start off, when we called for this international justice mechanism, largely we called for it based on the words of the Secretary General, Build Back Better. And because of this exponential increase in what we are saying of migrant worker abuse and exploitation, and particularly we focused on this area of wage theft because we've seen businesses have taken advantage of the COVID as well in not paying their workers, that we called for the international community that if you are going to build back better, you have to look at this big justice deficit that exists for migrant workers. And to address it, we've called upon the UN system kind of thing to come together on this, because there's been some experience of the UN system coming in addressing situations like this, where you see crime happening at a massive scale. We've called on something like IOM, ILO to come together and see how to set up some kind of a commission and a fund that will be able, because there might be some genuine cases of businesses going bankrupt at a time like this, and there will be some kind of fund would have to be put together where the business cannot pay back kind of things. At least you can give from this fund, so fund that would be made up by states putting in, so state taking responsibility in that sense for ensuring that justice is done. So we've called it some kind of like a commission at the international level with national commissions kind of thing that would be set up of different stakeholders to take on these volume of cases, because we know that something else aside from the regular system has to be set up, or the regular system needs to be improved with political will 100-fold kind of thing, which we have not seen in ordinary times. In ordinary times, they have not been able to cope with the cases. They have been inefficient, they have been insufficient, and they have not been expedient. Now we need an expedited system, a sufficient system, and an efficient system to address this situation. And so something aside from the regular would have to be put up as in this extraordinary time. So a national commission, sub-commission kind of thing with an international commission.
And would you sort of envisage that there would be big sort of class actions and bigger sort of test cases, or is it something that individual migrant workers might be able to access?
Once a system is put up, we are hoping, because it's not only the big cases, it's about the migrant worker who is remitting something like $100 every 2 months to his family, who has not been paid for 6 months. If you go for the big cases only, then you're not going to have full justice or not the opportunity of justice. So we want a system that is put up where a migrant worker now can access it. A migrant worker can approach the system and say, this is how I have been cheated, or this is what has happened to me, and he can seek for justice in that system, or she.
So there clearly needs to be input and engagement from government on this. And we were talking earlier about how migrant workers are driving so many of these economies. But do you think that support from government will be forthcoming?
You see, this is the tricky part of it, and this is the frightening part of it, in the sense of you'll see a big crime being committed and going unaddressed. And I'm saying the tricky part of it is because countries of origin, for instance, have not taken up this issue in the way that they should. They've recognized this, and you have some countries that have come and forward and said workers have not been paid and they are not being sent, and they are being sent back home, but they have not started procedures. They have not started taking this up to say, okay, how we've got 500 workers who came back, they were not been paid, how is this going to be settled? This kind of conversation is not started with countries of origin. My fear is, because if they become aggressive like that, or if they want to take it up like that, future markets might be closed to them.
Right.
And so it's a market perspective and a kind of thing that is holding them back, holding countries of origin back. Countries of destination are not at this stage willing to come forward to say any injustice done. So the whole due diligence on their part is totally absent, kind of thing, when they are not coming forward and saying no worker is going to be repatriated without being given the chance to make a labor complaint and without making sure that he or she has an access to justice, kind of thing. So that kind of dialogue is not yet happening. And because countries of our destination as well, in a certain sense, now what we are seeing is where countries of destination, because of the fear that the markets will not just suddenly, will not suddenly come back to normal, kind of thing. It will be some time before it comes back to normal. So countries of destination are willing to take this kind of risk of seeing workers go away because the businesses are not going to be picking up so fast. So their due diligence on their part is sadly missing as well.
So once again, it's viewing migrant workers and the supply of migrant workers as a tap that you can turn on and off at will, and this lack of leverage of countries of origin with regard to countries of destination, because they're so keen for their workers to travel and work abroad. So, William, how could business and civil society organisations support the justice mechanism and your calls to promote it?
I think business should already do a rapid assessment of the entire supply chains and check if there is anywhere, and I know in the past prior to COVID, businesses have taken accountability for a supply chain, but to a certain level, to the second level, or that kind of thing. But I think now we have to do a real rapid assessment of the entire supply chain. And businesses should be able to say that if any worker who has not been paid their wages is entitled to their wage. This is something that businesses have to do. Businesses have to give workers an opportunity. And within that opportunity, there have to be several modalities of it where a worker can make a complaint, kind of thing, or can say that, I have not been paid my wages. We have to remove that fear from the workers. We have to give the workers the hope and the opportunity that they can recover what is due to them, because they are not asking for more than what is due to them. And that is what businesses will have to recognize. Businesses will have to recognize that even in this time of crisis and COVID, their obligation to their workers, because of which the business is sustained, have to be given the first priority when it comes to addressing the situation of the COVID. At the end of the day, I think we have to look at this in this whole thing of businesses as they struggle to look at how they are going to come out of this COVID, as governments look at how they're going to come out of this COVID, and as the UN system thinks of how to build back better, at least in the whole concept of migrant workers and migration governance. We have to look less at governance in terms of mobility, but we also have to look at governance in terms of where justice is seen as entitlement.
And I guess that we have to hope that what comes out of that is that we actually do build back better, because the existing system wasn't that good in the first place, with systemic challenges that you've sort of identified earlier, that this perhaps gives us a unique opportunity to address some of these systemic challenges in the way that migrant workers are recruited and employed all around the world.
Yes, and I think what we basically need to do is, because you see, you had a lot around in terms of frameworks. We have the Dhaka principles, we have the ILO's ethical guiding principles, ethical recruitment guidelines, kind of thing. We've had the SDGs, we have the Global Compact on migration. You have all these kind of frameworks that, unfortunately, in the time of COVID, none of them became a reference point for response and for action. But now we have this opportunity, we really have this opportunity to look at where all these streams come together and how they become the foundation of what we want to build as we come out of COVID. This is what we need to do. It's like building up after the destruction of war kind of thing. Economies have been devastated, are going through a difficult time and things like that. But now when we want to build back, we have to build it up for all, especially for migrant workers, I think, who have been so essential to the development of economies.
William, thank you. And our time is up, but that's a great place to end our conversation, I think. Thank you so much for sharing your views and comments with us today. They're always so valuable for those of us who are familiar with the subject, but also perhaps for people who are not so familiar. And there's certainly plenty there for us to go away and reflect on. We will, of course, direct people to the Migrant Forum in Asia website, where they can find out a lot more information about your organisation, but more importantly about the call for the justice mechanism and how people might get involved. So thank you, William, very much. Thank you to everyone who's been watching this video. Please visit our website at www.ihrb.org for more information about our migrant workers programme and the other areas that we're working on. William, thank you again. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Neill. Thank you. Thank you.
নাম হাবিব, আমি প্রবাসে রয়েছি 12 বছর দুবাই রয়েছি, বিদেশ থেকে बोगुलाम हाल्ची ल्यापरा कराइছি।
कोरोना विरुद्ध कोरोना के हो र यसको विरुद्धमा कसरी सामाजिक दूरी कायम गर्न सकिन्छ र विदेशबाट आउनेलाई मात्र कोरोना हुन्छ भन्ने भावना रहेको र
താഴത്തെ നിലയിൽ ബാത്റൂമിലാണുള്ളത്. അവരെ കൊറോണ ബാധിച്ചവരെ കിടത്തിയിരുന്നത് താഴത്തെ നിലയിലുള്ള ബാത്റൂമിനകത്താണ്. നമുക്ക് എങ്ങനെയെങ്കിലും നാട്ടിലെത്തിയാൽ മതി എന്നുള്ള ഒരൊറ്റ ചിന്തയിലാണുള്ളത്.
नमस्ते, मेरो नाम सलिना कुमार। म दुबईको आबुधाबी स्थित सलुनमा, सानो सलुनमा काम गर्थेँ र म यो कोभिडको कारणले गर्दाखेरि बेतलबी बिदामा बस्नु परेको थियो।
এদেশে আসছি, এদেশে বাইরের জন্য কাজ নেই, রাস্তা নেই, আমরা অনেক কষ্ট পাচ্ছি।
कोभिड-19 ले समस्या पारेका क्षेत्रहरूमध्ये श्रमिकहरू अथवा माइग्रेन्ट वर्करलाई पारेको समस्या एकदमै ठुलो छ जस्तो मलाई लाग्छ। धेरै साथीहरूले आफ्नो जब गुमाउनु भयो, कसैले आफ्नो स्यालेरी भन्दा कम्तीमा काम गर्नु पर्यो, को लामो समयसम्म बेतलबी विधामा बस्नु पर्ने भयो।
ഞാൻ ബഹ്റിനിൽ വർക്ക് ചെയ്തിരുന്നു 13 വർഷം. 10 വർഷം ഒരു ലേബർ കമ്പനിയിലായിരുന്നു. അവിടെ നിന്നും എനിക്ക് 10 വർഷത്തെ സർവീസ് ചാർജും 2 വർഷത്തെ ലീവ് സാലറിയും 3.5 മാസത്തെ ശമ്പളവും കിട്ടാനുണ്ട്।
কোম্পানির কাছে 4 লক্ষর উপরে টাকা পাবো, তাই আমি কর্তৃপক্ষের কাছে আবেদন করতেছি এবং আমি জোর দাবি জানাচ্ছি যে আমার এই লিভ স্যালারিটা যেন আপনারা আইনে দেন।
We called for the international community that if you are going to build back better, you have to look at this big justice deficit that exists for migrant workers.